So I think on the panel, we've got like people with experience from various sectors. Of course, we have Shagoofa, who's represented the fund. She's been in law firms and she's from the industry. Shinjni, of course, has great experience, and Anuja has been playing the balancing act. You know, she's been working with law firms. She's been advising corporates and funds. So I think that experience would really help in the discussions going forward. So glocalization for me would be using local power and using them with global resources. Glocalization is a concept that is obviously an evolution of the word globalization, and until recently, I think until COVID really happened, we were not able to scale the Indian, at least whatever we had within the Indian industry to that limit and to the maximum optimization we've done of the local resources. Also considering the fact that India is very rich in manpower, labor is cheap, and there are a lot of natural resources in India which can be used to scale up the economy. From the perspective of Indian economy, we've attracted a lot of foreign investment. I have seen a great amount of shift in the mindset of the Indian players, because there's a lot of importance being given to safety aspect. Typically in India, if you see, the infrastructure projects are won on bidding. So there's competitive bidding, and there's very little scope for great tariffs or great margins. The margins are very low. So safety aspect and other ESG related aspects, which are the thrust, or you can say which are on the focus for most of the investors, these are very, very tough to abide with, because there's cost element. And considering the fact that India historically has not been very high on compliance, I think there's a great shift. We certainly have compliance officers, we have ESG heads, and this specific aspect has kind of changed the economies for all of us. So I think over to you, Shagoofa. My first question to you would be, what investment structure or trends have fared well in attracting global and domestic capital into infrastructure opportunities?
Yeah. So the role that we, at least just to give a little bit of context, is we are the capital providers, we as the funds, as the investors. Of course, we have a huge way to sort of, or huge path to cross as far as infrastructure development is concerned in India. We as a nation are a capital-starved nation, especially on infra development. We do have the ability to attract global capital. I mean, when he gave the introduction of 24 years, it is 24 plus years, and I remember my early days when we used to make presentations, we had a few slides where we used to say, why India? We had to go out there and pitch to the investors, why should you come and look at India? Why should you be investing into India? Today, we don't have those slides, because India is the sweet spot from an investment opportunity perspective. So the trends keep changing, the structures keep changing, but because of the nature of the beast that infrastructure is, we have to address some of the requirements, right? So the recent structures that have actually worked, because one of the feedback that we used to get from global pension funds when we were trying to tap them and get them into equity investments in infrastructure. Infrastructure has attracted debt capital. We've got various vehicles that have brought debt capital into the sector, but equity investments was something that they always stayed away because the risk was very high. The long gestation period, the entire PPP model, has it worked, has it not worked? We could debate till the cows come home. And the risk that was inherent in terms of, will those revenues that are being underwritten, will they really work out or pan out in the time span that they were looking at? So what in the recent years, I would say, which has really worked, is the entire combination of the AIF structure and now the InvIT structure. So the AIF structure gave the ability for the new funds, the global pension funds, who weren't ready to take the risk themselves, who weren't ready to come here, identify a right partner, sit on their boards and direct them, were able to come through the AIF. So the AIFs actually have become, in some way, the incubation vehicles. And if you look in the market, and not necessarily that I'm naming any competitors out here, but with due respect to every other fund manager in the country, you have, in vehicles like the Edelweiss vehicle, which recently did their InvIT as well. So it was incubated in an AIF structure. The assets were taken into that. They went through the entire, from greenfield to a mature state. And when they were in the state of being operational as defined under the InvIT regulations, they have now gone into the InvIT structure. So the InvIT structure has played its role well. Nearly some 46,000 crores of debt has actually got an uptick in the credit rating because the cash flows are stable. The InvIT structure itself brings efficiency from a tax perspective. And the overall, supervision that comes with the SEBI regulations. So if you look at the SEBI regulations, they are very well crafted to address the needs of a global investor who's used to seeing certain governance framework outside India when they are coming into India. So you have provisions in relation to investor consents already embedded in the regulations. You have obligations of the trustee, the manager, statutorily prescribed in the regulations. There's nothing to negotiate out there. And also the related party concerns, because in the infra space, there are several ways where, leakages could happen. You could have related parties, paying off fees to other concerns within the system, and therefore the economics for the investor goes down. So to sum it up in that sense, I would say the AI structure, along with the combination of the InvIT structure, has really worked well. And I'm sure if you're following the InvIT sector, you are seeing the yields that it's generating. Predominantly, we are still we have about 9 InvITs which are in the road sector. We have total InvITs of 20. So there are some transmission assets, but predominantly we are seeing only road assets. We would like to see other assets also getting monetized. And as part of the NIP and as part of NIF, our mandate is also to bring investable projects into the market. So we do work on those aspects with various government departments, and we hope to see some other assets coming into the InvIT zone in a matter of few years.
So I have a question, Shagoofa. I think typically if you see within 5 years, if you invest in a company, that company is on the block, right? That's typically the pattern I've been observing in the past. Why India though? I mean, do you think India is giving those kind of returns, or why India?
No, I think the opportunity for investments is here, right? Why India is because where do you get the ability to invest in large-scale projects, and especially talk about infrastructure. Of course, private equity deals are also happening. Why India? The consumption market is there, the demand is there, the assets are there. I think the biggest point is the regulations that have come about. And that is the conversation that we used to have a few years back, where we were trying to explain that, okay, if you're investing into India, for example, in the earlier structures, there was only a holding company concept, right? Because infrastructure, the liability, you would want to ring fence. And each SPV having its own asset under it, and then you have a holdco. But the investors were not willing to come into a holdco structure, because when you're looking from an exit point of view, see, every investor, when he's looking at an investment opportunity, is already calculating the exit way. Yes. And if you don't create the exit path for the investor, he's really not interested in hearing the investment story, however great the story on returns would be. So the entire holding company structures, then we lobbied and we got the FVCI structures, but all of them had inherent, issues from an exit point of view. The InvIT structure gives you that listed vehicle. It gives you the ability to get the exit as and when you want. And even I think the market has matured. So you even have larger listed companies out there to create the IPOs, to give the exit. The other thing which has happened in the infrastructure space is the SPAC. You have these offshore vehicles where you're able to list them. You take a blank check company, put the asset in it, and then you can monetize that asset. So I think the investment thesis was there. The worry was, how will the exit play out, maybe from an enforcement of the contract perspective, maybe from an opportunity of the exit perspective.
And also a lot of concessions had this lock-in period where the investors couldn't exit. And with all the policy advocacy that's happened in the recent past, people are able to exit smoothly, right?
Correct. So I think we have demonstrated exits. Let's say that also. The exits have played out well, and that has given the comfort as well to the investors.
Yes. Shinji, what about glocalization in your sector? Because aviation sector is the most sought after sector, considering the fact that recently the big Air India move has also happened. So,
good you started off with that the historic transaction. I think that transaction itself, if you look at the larger perspective, not only it is helping economies abroad, but in India also you have suppliers coming in and setting up MROs. So you have the likes of Thales, who's coming up and setting up an avionics MRO. So what happens is, in I wouldn't say in an exact sense of a globalization, but there is a lot of global companies which are coming to the local markets and helping in employment generation, as well as, improving the airport aviation infrastructure in general. So there's a lot of impetus from the government to, set up an MRO hub in India, to tout it as an MRO hub. And there is a lot of incentives being given. Like, for example, the GST has been lowered from 18% to 5%. There is custom duty that has been waived for spare parts, which is an integral part of the aircraft, manufacturing. So there is a lot of, I would say, localized initiatives that are happening in India. And other than that, in the aviation sector, there are other sort of aspects like the UDAN scheme. You have the sustainable aviation fuel, initiatives being taken, a lot of focus being put on that. So aviation is moving in somewhat sense towards globalization, but I would say India in itself is so self-sufficient that we are, very much spearheading ourselves in that direction, whether it's any of the airlines you take, whether it's Indigo, Air India. So ourselves, we are taking a lot of initiatives which are helping other economies also, like the historic order that I'm talking about. So it's a good space to be in right now to see that interplay that's happening, where we are, the airlines, the government, and the airports are working in conjunction to support the aviation sector.
And of course, there's another angle to it, the tax. Shagoofa, probably that question is again for you. In the tax aspect, there are a lot of incentives being given to, these pension funds, and suddenly, if there's some revocation, how do you deal with that? Because we've seen that at least in renewable sector, there's sudden BCD, it changes the dynamics of the transaction altogether, and then there's a change in law clause, you take about 3 years, 5 years to get the money, by then the investors have already exited. So how do you see that, considering the fact that there is some little wavering?
See, in fact, the good and bad part about tax is that it changes every year, right? And unfortunately, this sector has always had, exemptions with a sunset clause. Yeah. So, whenever the sunset, timeline is coming up, there is, a flurry of representations being made to the government that, you need to extend it because there is so much of investment in the pipeline, it needs to see it through and all of that. So yes, the Sovereign Wealth Fund exemption that came about, a couple of years ago, again, is an outcome of the various efforts that were made with the government. If you see across the globe, several countries give exemption to foreign, government entities investing in their countries to incentivize. And obviously, these are government agencies, so they should not be paying the tax of another government, right? So there was a need felt that we also need to encourage that. While there is, huge amount of domestic capital, if you look at, large AUM with the EPFO, with the PFRDA, with the insurance companies, but a fraction of it comes into infrastructure. So we have to rely on global capital. And if you have to rely on global capital, you have to make Indian investments competitive. And tax is a huge amount of
and
it,
support
right?
them as well.
Right. So, I remember this old phrase when I used to do tax advice is that, your own domestic tax is obviously your social contribution, but a foreign tax is a cost in your balance sheet. So you really want to reduce the costs, right? So that is where the lobbying efforts do happen. And to be fair, our government did take that feedback into consideration, and we, for the last couple of years, had the Sovereign Wealth Fund exemption going on. It does grant exemption for income from dividends, interest, and capital gains. But the unfortunate part is that it's going to expire in March 24, and it has a host of conditions attached to it. So while the conditions are workable, I think the biggest concern today is, will there be an extension beyond March 24? So the investments have to be made before March 2024. Does that mean that we don't want investments after that? Does that mean that what is in the pipeline should not be grandfathered? So those are open questions, and frankly, tax certainty is something we really need to continuously work on, because we talk about estoppel not being against the government, but in these matters it becomes extremely embarrassing that you are out there, you're getting large money into the projects, and then you're not able to give them the promised tax benefits. So frankly, I don't think there's a clear answer to this. We'll just have to live through the uncertainty, and hopefully, good sense will prevail and it'll get extended.
Also, if you see recently, international standards on health safety have gained a lot of momentum. We see that in contracts, and initially these contractors would sign anything. Now they know there's a lot of emphasis, so they also want to push back on a lot of clauses. We've seen that with even large players who are internationally acclaimed, and when they suddenly come to India and you outsource a contract to them, they want to push back on standard IFC clauses. So Anuja, where do you see, because you've been representing both sides, right? And this, I would say, is a combination of a global expertise coming to Indian market. And it is, of course, very difficult to implement those things in India, because in India, we know how safety standards are. I mean, even if you're on a bike, you don't wear your helmet. And then how do you expect these big projects with 5,000, 6,000 manpower to be abiding by those standard safety norms?
No, absolutely. In fact, when I started my career, the EPC contracts that used to be drafted, when the FIDIC model was introduced in India, there was so much resistance because people were like, no, we don't want to use the silver book, we want to use the yellow book, we want to use the red book, and then came up a pink book. And, the resistance was because of the fact of, the global impact and the global requirement of how do you do the business in India, where there's a set pattern of doing a business in India. Now, what it has resulted to over the years is the fact that today you have IFC standards. I'm taking a step ahead and I'm saying now people are talking about greenwashing. So, to Shagoofa's point, while InvIT is a great, vehicle, is a form of vehicle for investment, and people are looking at these investments coming in, but the key in the exit strategy is that once you have done the InvIT of operational projects, you are essentially managing these assets. And you have to bring these assets up to a certain level where at the time of exit, you get credible investors who pay you the return that you're expecting. That would mean that the housekeeping that you have to do in the interim period is going to be quite a phenomenal task. And then that means that you're looking to either amend the contracts or you're looking to renegotiate the contracts. And that's where I think a skilled lawyer will come in to say that, look, I'm not going to open the entire contract and upset the apple cart, but I need to rearrange my cart. Because if you don't do that rearrangement of cart, maybe you bought decent apples, but they're going to rot over a period of time. So what do? And therefore, this glocalization, the requirements of the lenders, the expectation that perhaps the potential investors at the time, who are currently invested and the ROI they are looking at, the exit strategy, etc., this will all come back to the ever-evolving requirements that are coming into play. And it's just the way the world is structured now today. If you have a Nordic company who's one of the sponsors or the investors in your InvIT, now by law, greenwashing has become mandatory for them. So they are now going to come back and tell you, look, this is the requirement of my jurisdictions flowing into my country, now my company, now you tell me how do you sort it out. And what happens is, because the rest of the other investors are not used to these conditions, they are like, what do we do about this?
Yeah, so
and implementation, therefore,
yes,
is the challenge.
Yes, I think at a ground level implementation is because we also have like a series of investors, and we have different compliance from each of the investors. So it becomes increasingly difficult because there are lots of BI related compliance, ESG related compliance, labor related compliance. So it's all so difficult for us because eventually if you go to the site, it may not be as per their requirements. So that becomes very tough. And then of course, it's yeah.
So can we just add? See, I think, when we keep talking about ESG, personally, and I think most of the institutions like us would believe that G is the most important of the ESG, right? Yes. If you have your governance right, no matter what the law says, you will follow a particular standard, right? So from our perspective, we in fact have created our own ESG policy, which is based on the IFCs, but we have customized it for the Indian context, right? So we can't say that it's going to be tough to follow, because I think those days of saying that is way behind us. We are attracting capital which comes with that price of compliance. So you have to invest into the compliance framework. You have to hire teams. If you look at our ESG team, it's one of the largest teams, as large as our deal teams. And it's a completely independent team. It's part of our underwriting process. It's part of our ongoing monitoring process. It's also part of our exit, because tomorrow we don't want to give reps and warranties that we are going to stand exposed to from indemnities perspective. So I think it's possible, but it will have its challenges. So for example, as GCs, what we didn't want to encounter was our portfolio companies, reporting to us incidents of health and safety, where either people are injured on their sites or fatalities. Now, sitting as a fund, with that knowledge that there's something happening in the portfolio company, we can't take the approach that, it's a separate legal entity, our liabilities ring-fenced, they are reporting to us, we will write back a simple, warning letter to them. That's not it. We actually get involved. Yes. We send our team. Our team goes and monitors, okay, what was it?
Spot audits.
Not just spot audits, but these are actual audits to say that this particular company has reported X number of incidents. Why? Why is it that this company is repeatedly, escalating incidents in relation to, environment or health and safety, and why is this becoming a pattern?
In fact, it's seeing a greater accountability.
Yes, and I think accountability is being imposed. Earlier what it used to be, just write those clauses. There's an ABAC clause, there's a standard ESG clause, there's a standard reporting clause. But now these are all,
that's why I said suddenly there's a lot of pushback. Right? People do not want to accept those clauses because they know that it's actually at a ground level, people are enforcing those. Yes.
But like I said, it comes with the money.
Yes.
The color of money is green in this sense because we want you to be green in your operations.
In fact, it's very, very interesting because, Shagoofa, it's not the only the GCs. As external counsels, we are now not looking at just getting the deal done. Okay, an M&A transaction happened, closing happened, and money came, and that's about it. Today, we actually post-transaction, the kind of assistance that clients are expecting from us. I'm literally on their speed dial for these exact ESG issues, because even if an FIR is reported, or somebody is injured at the site, or there's an in your sector that we were discussing, if there is an new we are in waste management business and there is a new chemical that has come in and no liability is accorded to in under contracts, what do you do? Now their external counsels also now have to sensitize themselves to the requirements of what these investors are looking at. The transaction is being viewed from a very different lens, and therefore your responsibility and your competence to be able to service the client has to be glocalized as well. So it's not local anymore as well for us.
Should you say something? There is one here.
That's it. No, I would say in aviation also, there is a bit of, ESG focus that's coming in. So you have airlines like Indigo that has come up with their ESG report. It's one of the first airlines that came up with their ESG report. The second report that came in last year, the title of the report in itself was Flying Responsibly. So there is that focus that airlines are also putting towards the ESG, and what initiatives they can take in that respect. So one of the initiatives that they are taking is usage of SAF, that is Sustainable Aviation Fuel. So even Air India has signed an MOU with the Institute of Petroleum for joint development and research of sustainable aviation fuels. So there is, across sectors, I would say, there is a lot of focus that is coming towards ESG.
So while, of course, I think we've discussed about sustainability, ESG, integrity is another aspect that is a global requirement which is now being ingrained in the Indian culture. And that is also a tough one because we know where we are on the corruption index. So what are your thoughts? I mean, I think that's a very interesting topic.
See, I think I don't want to sound like we are setting the highest benchmark or whatever, but it's a process, right? When we as a fund go out there and raise money from our global investors, who themselves are sovereign funds and global pension funds, they have a certain requirement in terms of integrity issues. They have certain requirements of minimum diligence that we need to do in relation to the counterparties that we are going to be engaging with. So forget about doing a diligence on the project. We are looking at the individuals, the UBOs, and we are also looking at UBOs of the portfolio funds that we are investing in. So it is becoming I would say, a complex assessment, and it's an ongoing assessment. And in fact, if you see the recent thing that SEBI has done, that so far the AIF regulations never prescribed it. The AIF regulations were silent on what level of KYC you are supposed to do. You could, have your own policy, but SEBI has now put it in the regulations. So which is also showing a sign that the regulators themselves, seeing the practices that they are seeing maybe or engaging with when they are interacting with their counterparts in these other countries, are also bringing these learnings in. So it's not just the investors who are imposing these obligations on us, but it is the regulator also who's expecting us to be vigilant in terms of who it is that is coming into the entire ecosystem of the fund industry. So to answer your question on integrity, I think the one thing that we do is the training sessions, not just at our level, but also at a portfolio company level. I don't think it's an easy fix, because sometimes we face a lot of resistance in getting information. We also have information which then is said that, okay, it's confidential, we can't share it, or, we are confirming to you that there's no UBO. And how do you satisfy yourself that there's no UBO, and how do you satisfy that that person is actually meeting all the tests that you're supposed to comply with? So I think for us, it's an ongoing process, and I don't think, while on ESG, we feel that people understand and are more open to, put the process in place, we see a little bit of resistance on the integrity side, for whatever reasons, but it is still there, and I think it's evolving at the moment.
And in fact, just to add to Shagoofa's point, in fact, let me just come back to the problem. The problem is always that of implementation. The question here is not that nobody understands the definition of integrity. The problem is that if there are certain local practices that have been followed for donkey's years now how do we fix them? Because, say, I'll give you a small example. In every infrastructure project, there is land acquisition. Now, there is a certain way in which the land acquisition happens in this country, for a variety of reasons, whether it is customary, whether it is something that was just developed because it was more efficient, and, you sort of create layers because you don't want the land prices to shoot up, this, that, and the other. Now, the question is, if you bring the highest of integrity standards into the Indian market, you are cost conscious. You want the process to happen, you want actually the land acquisition to be completed, and you are now faced with this entire battery of people who are used to a certain way of doing business. Now, what do you do about it? And then the question is, this local practices is a jurisdictional risk that you put in your book saying that this is how India functions, or do you say, no, I'm going to fix it and get my deal done, and then you become a roadblock to the deal per se? Or the third way to look at it is, do you become cost conscious and you say that, okay, I want to do the business, now how do I do business? But this is these are the rules of the game, so what do we do? So I absolutely agree with you that it's very, very difficult to understand what is the benchmark, what do you see as integrity, whether it is in its more purest form that you're going to look at it, or you are going to customize it again, the global standards becoming local standards, or are you going to say that, okay, fine, these are my global standards, this is something I can live with, this I cannot live with. And there again, as external counsels, we face this issue that where do we tell our clients that this is what India looks like, this is what your integrity standards are, but this is what the practice is.
And I intentionally stayed away from that. I kept my answer very far away from that. But yeah, there are a host of shades of grays on that front.
But just out of curiosity, so how do you advise these clients that what is the model they should take? You very interestingly listed out 3 models. So it must be a catch-22 situation for you to advise them on, okay, which models to take. Because end of the day, they want to be cost conscious, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And clients are cost conscious towards us also. So, and I'm graying fairly quickly, so you can clearly understand how. But I mean, quite honestly, there is no one solution to this problem. There is, of course, one has to understand the sensitivities of the client. One also has to understand the sort of urgency to get the work done. Every particular problem has its own shades. But the attempt and a thumb rule that I follow at least is that I put the pros and cons of the practical situation and the expectation of the client in front of the client and tell them that, look, this is the best case solution that you have in front of you. Now, how much it is digestible within your system or not is something we can help you navigate. But at the end of the day, this is the reality of the day. And there is nothing, nothing sort of sugar-coated in that advice.
So basically, Anuja is saying that she leaves the decision on the table of the GC. Commercial to take the call. Yeah, you guys take a call. These are the pros and cons, and it's your neck on the line. So I would just like to say one thing, as
based on my legal opinion.
Yes, with all the disclaimers in the opinion.
Yeah, qualifications.
Yeah, so just one aspect, whenever we have the discussion on legal risks, right? Because there are, you can segment the risk into various elements. So one thing which at least we as GCs try to harp and try to convince our CEOs or business decision makers is that, people say that, okay, what's the probability of it happening? What's the discovery, probability? If it gets discovered, what is the downside? So that quantification, all of that is possible, but somewhere you can't quantify the reputation risk, right? So the reputation loss can actually become a balance sheet loss because you don't know what that number will be. You don't know the impact that it will have on you, and your business can actually shut down. So I think in the overall assessment, and I'm not wanting to, comment on the certain practices that yes, they do exist in the nation, but I think we have to take an approach which is, the favorite buzzword again, like glocalization, is sustainable, right? You have to have a sustainable approach to your business. If you believe that these practices are going to just germinate and they're going to become so ingrained, like, eat into the woodworks or the framework of your organization, you have to, whatever the cost at that point in time, cut it off,
So,
right?
so I agree with you, Shagoofa. In fact, I have literally witnessed situations where we are increasingly becoming aware and conscious of these aspects. And there are companies that are just not ready to budge on the sustainability aspect, on ESG aspect. And they're like, no, whatever cost there is, we'll bear the cost. Even if we have to go down the drain, we will. And that's the kind of message we have been getting from global investors, which I think wouldn't be the case 10 years ago, where there were, there wasn't so much investment from other companies and sovereign funds. So I think there are areas where people, like funds, there's zero tolerance, yeah. So.
But then also this is also a function of sector-specific issues. Like, there are certain sectors where you find semi-sophisticated or highly sophisticated local players,
Correct.
local partners.
Yes.
But if you move to certain sectors, say for instance, waste industry, right? These are, promoter-driven small
Correct.
businesses or municipalities, etc., where the sophistication level is so low that you have to actually start from the level of educating them upwards and then
Correct.
implementation.
So Anuja, now that we have a lot of investment in these sectors as well, because there's a Green Growth Climate Fund, which has got money from all the sovereign funds, and they are investing in these sectors, then of course, it uplifts the sector altogether, like which was not the case probably even with the solar and renewable industry some 10 years ago. You saw a paradigm shift there. And here also, that's why we need global investors in these sectors as well. Roads has seen a change. You've seen renewable energy coming a long way. And now, of course, the new sector could be waste management or any other sustainable sector.
But you might be facing that challenge in your sector the most, like she said. You don't have that many sophisticated players in the sector, even though they're backed by these funds.
Recently, if you see KKR invested, there are global players coming in. So I think even this sector is going to thrive soon. And of course, with foreign investment,
But on a day-to-day basis, you do see that challenge.
Yes,
bringing
of course, there is a
mindset change
challenge.
to
Yes,
the promoters,
yes.
explaining that aspect to them.
Like
right?
I said, we've got there's zero tolerance.
Okay.
So we can probably be bleeding on a project, but that's the impact globalization has on the Indian economy. That's why it's so wonderful. Yeah. So yeah, I think we can just leave, probably have some questions from the audience. If
You gave me the first opportunity because my question plus a comment was regarding this integrity. And I did hear that, Anuja is a colleague, and of course, we know that there are these day-to-day issues. But equally, we have seen a lot of change as well. So there have been foreign companies who have come long, long ago and have taken a stance, right? And that has led to change. Like one of my largest clients several years ago was a Alcobev client, and it's really bad, at that level. Every state, the small little licenses that are required. But they took this zero tolerance stance, and they did reasonably well. They ultimately exited, but they exited at a decent price. But and there have been other entities like GE Capital, Coca-Cola. When all these guys came into India, they came in with that zero tolerance sort of mode. So I think in some ways my question is that while we understand this day-to-day issue, if it's like if you're talking about ESG and sustainability holistically, then I think the industry has to take a stance. And, I just wanted to find out, because I do appreciate waste management is still very, very small, segmented. But when these KKRs and all are coming in, then obviously the potential to take an industry stand perhaps increases. And, even in the very early days of FCPA, when we used to put that in our contract, our promoter clients used to tell us, ye kya hai? Like, this is a foreign law, it's a US law, why is it even mentioned in my contract? But now we've seen that resistance has completely disappeared. So in fact, they have started using these anti-bribery clauses in their vendor contracts as well.
No, absolutely. It affects the. It's a very interesting point, Viniti. Now, this fine balance of staying on your principles and at the same time getting the deal done. It may affect a sector for some time. For instance, waste management. I'm just taking one example. The deal flow was affected for a very, very long time because you wouldn't find sophisticated players. You wouldn't find that all the boxes are ticked, etc. for your partners that you're looking at. Halfway through the diligence, you'll realize there is a lot of mess there, you'll back off. And there is capital to be deployed, but you are not able to do it because there are certain standards that just will not fly. It affected the sector, the growth of the sector. That's why today when we talk about waste management, despite government talking about Swachh Bharat and this and that, nothing really happened. But the good thing is that if you keep up with your principles and if you go with zero tolerance policy, you may bleed on some matters, you may have a slower deal flow, but eventually it will be better for the sector. Because eventually, people will up their game because they'll realize that their neighbors in other sectors are raking money while you are not, because you are not doing your housekeeping right. So I think it is for the better for the nation. It's good for us that we actually come up to the standards that the world requires us to perform at. So I think principles first, obvious.
I just have two comments here. I think one is to Shagoofa's point. Earlier, we only had GICs and IFCs insisting on the ESG requirements in the fund negotiation. But now even we have fund of funds, family offices, they're very high on this and they tell us, we can negotiate the commercial terms, but this will not change at all. Word to word, they won't have an appendix attached to the agreement, and they want no changes from that. That's, I think, one change we have observed. Even Indian fund managers, I know NIF has a very, very high standard in terms of ESG, but other fund managers who are just starting off, like simple VC funds in Bangalore, I was really impressed recently. I went to meet them, and they had this kind of a whole, and it's like there was no pressure on them to do it. It was like a lot of they have been speaking to a lot of other people across the globe, and they have got this whole value that, we should do something more meaningful in that category. The second comment I had was basically on the issue of integrity. And I was a part of some FCPA investigations early in my career, and that stands for Foreign Corruption Prevention Act. And a lot of the US corporates, and US has got its own demerits, lobbying culture. But to be fair to them, a lot of corporates were losing contracts in Nigeria because they had to follow FCPA, and then we have the contract given to China or Russia, as example. But to be fair to them, I think the US stuck with the FCPA laws, and the fear was so high even in the Indian subsidiaries. So when we had to have a Diwali, basically, we have the email bakshish, Diwali, they have to distribute sweets on Diwali. So we have to track down every single email that every single person in the company will follow certain guidelines. India is an amazing opportunity, but I just feel that we don't have a US level legislation in India just uniformly applied to all the parties. I do feel a lot of diversities, deviations, exceptions being made, and that's the sad part. So if you really want to go to the next level in terms of we don't have to have an exception for if it's a land acquisition, you have to have certain laws. No matter who's acquiring the land, which corporate house, which political party, doesn't really matter. Follow the law, and that's where I feel there's a lot of deviations in terms of, look at, South Korea, with the Samsung CEO was put behind the bars. Can we have the same thing in India? And that's a big challenge we have to all, it's a kind of hard question to face. Yeah, but again, we can get into it. There are a lot of political connotations to it. I'm saying, do you apply the laws uniformly to all the parties? A peasant somewhere sitting in, Jharkhand or Orissa, if something was, there are different ways. I've been involved in some NGOs, working how the land was acquired. And honestly, it hasn't been, at all in terms of compliance with law. And there is a lot of terms of, it's a wider network in terms of, corporate houses, local police administration, judiciary all get involved and save a certain party. And that's what my broad feedback is, and I'm telling it very openly. What I'm saying is that we need to have that law across the country for all the corporates with no exceptions, no deviations, for all the people.
And digitization is helping us go a long way because, all these licenses, at least that are to be that are required for workmen, are all be applied online now, which wasn't the case 5 years ago. So I think it's we're progressing definitely.
Yeah, but I think we require a political will as well at the highest level to do that. We can do all corporatization, digitalization, but we have to have that rule of law in real spirit, circulation across the country, not just applied to few political parties.
I think I really agree with you on that one because I see very specific corporate houses implementing it from their own perspective. Like Tata, I'm sure Shagoofa also agrees. There's that Tata Code of Conduct, which has the highest integrity standards internally and our relationship with the vendors that we need to follow. As you rightly mentioned, there is no law that uniformly applies to across the corporates. It's the corporate who's taking that initiative independently, based on the values and missions that they believe in. Right?
And I think also that whole issue of delivery mechanism, in the sense that today if you find a company is doing any corruption act, it shouldn't drag on for 10 years. You got to have a fast action, taken impose penalties. I mean the US fines are so onerous, like $1 billion for a 50 million company. They are very scared to do anything on those lines. If you can have something for India would be great, I think.
In fact, our Corruption Act until recently only dealt with demand of, a bribe. It didn't deal with supply of bribes. So I think I completely agree with you that, because if you're paying a public servant, the demand is from a public servant. I think the point is valid that from an enforcement point of view, still we have, an ability, and with due respect to our judges, but, even the judiciary has a certain level of corruption where people can get away, right? So I think that is an ill that we need to sort out. But even before you reach that level, which is where we're trying to address, at least as institutional managers, that we start from the ground up, that we create institutions, we create our own portfolio companies, where there is a certain fabric, there's a certain ethos, there's a certain compliance culture. If that is set in, then it will be a slow turn. But I think to answer your point also, right, the reason why it's easier now to get these clauses out there, there's a huge amount of transparency. And all the money that's coming into this sector is money that's accountable to the general public, right? So you don't want a parliamentary question, whether in this country or in any other country. So there is a very informed oversight also that's happening between the capital providers, the capital managers, and the portfolio companies. So it is an ecosystem that's building, Manish, but it will take time. I think, I completely agree with you that there is no fear. There's no fear of non-compliance, right? Are you going to end up in jail, or you can get yourself out of jail by paying somebody there as well? So I think, that fear hasn't set in yet because enforcement is still questionable in terms of timely delivery.
Some of the things that I think Indian law, there's actually nothing wrong with the law. Yeah. The law is actually even stricter than FCPA if you read between the lines and everything. I think you made that perhaps a passing remark on culture. Compliance culture and corporate vision was also said. But ultimately, it really boils down to culture and the people themselves. And while companies have visions that we have zero tolerance and we have this, there are some things that corporates inherently do, which sort of make you deviate, right? Like for instance, number targets, right? That excessive cost cutting. These are some of the contra cultures which sort of then breed these things, and then people are people. So I know of one particular incident where some delegation from the US was here. They told this guy that listen, we have to get to this place. This guy at short notice arranged a chopper. Obviously he did some things to get all of that, and then when everything came to light, his neck was on the line. But there was obviously things that drove the person to do whatever they do. And that's the overall culture issue.
And also, just to, the point is not that, as Vinati rightly said, it's not, the problem is not so much with law. The way it is written, and
the problem lies even in contracts. So I'm telling you, in my capacity as a transactional lawyer, the contracts that we negotiate, we get the highest of standards into the contract. And the intention of the parties are clearly written. Everything is like, the T's are sort of crossed and the I's are dotted. Everything is done. But the problem is that you do so much of cost cutting or so much of non-education of that contract to your contract management team that ultimately you have arbitrations. And then you have a problem in trying to understand what was the intent of the parties, how was the contract implemented, and that contract will then, as evidence, there are 10,000 other, supplemental contracts or amendments that have been issued because the people who are implementing the contract never understood the real commercials and went ahead and just kept doing it because they wanted to reach a certain target.
And also because the infrastructure projects are bid and there's competitive bidding, so margins are really low. And suddenly these are costs, like if there's, for example, an ESG requirement, it may just involve a lot of costs which no one's ready to bear.
exactly.
So then it goes to arbitration, it goes to disputes. So,
I just had one point to add. It's interesting having this AB Association conference. So, as a law firm, we work a lot with India focused funds, and it's been a great experience. Look at the comparison. We have these funds in Cayman Islands, in UK, Delaware is an example. It takes 6 hours to form a fund in Delaware. It takes 6 months in AIF. I'm a big fan of AIF regulations. We've been working with the CFO forum, and advising the government and Shagoofa being involved with this, how to make it more, quicker, because, we have this, practically the investors only have a 2 months mandate to invest in a certain fund. And by the time we get the license, they've already expired, and we again go back to them, get their IC guys. So, I'm a big fan of AIF, but I think there's also an element of over-regulation. I would, if I were a city person, I would just say that I would do a high level, the way it happens at the jurisdiction, have the manager being kind of supervised on an ongoing basis. There's a filing requirement from AZB. You regulate, there's certain set of guidelines you've got to follow, rather than kind of macro-managing everything, because my clients now, I think, spend 50% of their time looking at, the AIF regulations keep coming every second day. And it's like 6 years, you have a lot change in law in Delaware, every 6 days in AIF. So I think if India is supposed to becoming an attractive place for investment, and we have seen that change over the last, 1 year. Earlier, India, as Shagoofa already mentioned earlier, we have clients asking for a briefing. I said, don't waste your time. India already has a story. It's about your story. So they talk about your track record, talk about your credentials. Till said. But I'm saying India is in a good spot right now. I just feel that this kind of over-regulation, this scares these foreign investors away. For the first time, I think, great opportunity, because China is almost kind of closed down. We don't have Normans going to China anymore. The real pressure on them, and we have an opportunity where we're seen as an attractive place. But for that, we need to have that enabling flexibility in how we operate, but not kind of over-regulation and macro-managing or policing what we have to have a certain documents, certain way. It just becomes a little difficult for the fund manager to raise the funds. We have a difficult time drafting documents, challenging it, balancing it. That's what my high-level thought was.
Just to give some context to the rest of the audience, because you and I, are seeing this, from close quarters. I think one thing which is lacking from a regulator's perspective is institutional memory. There is no institutional memory, right? The learnings that go through with the regulator's team at that point in time is not getting passed on to the next team that comes along. So especially on the AI front, whenever there's a change of guard, the officers, go through a rotation of duties. The new person who comes in is green behind the ears, has never done these regulations, doesn't have history, doesn't have the ability to go back and, read maybe a training charter that these are the points that you must be looking out for. We actually go through a learning with every application with SEBI. Every application, we have to explain them that, okay, this is the context of the industry, this is the context of the clause, this is why it is needed. And then they sort of blur the lines that this is the regulator's role to, stay within the regulations and not get into the commercial aspects. They actually start asking, questions to be changed and language to be changed on commercial clauses. So I think the institutional memory is where the biggest problem is. So maybe if we can fix that, hopefully the regulator will also find it easier to transition. And of course, there is the IFSCA gift regime, where we are making it at par with the global standards. So there, the IFSCA regulates the manager, not the fund, whereas in mainland India, SEBI still regulates the fund and not the manager. So I believe we have our mind set in the right direction. It's a matter of time. We need to see some of these changes play out. We've gone through as a nation with multiple fundamental clauses and laws and regulations changing. We have to keep digesting it, right? I mean, starting with Companies Act 2013, we struggled. There were so many, discrepancies. So it'll take time. I do believe AIF regulations hopefully will settle currently in the context of where the regulator is seeing, mis-selling happening, lack of transparency in most of the fund products. So there is a little bit of a reactionary behavior from the regulator, but as an industry, we have to stay engaged with our regulator and hopefully find the right solutions.
I mean, just last one point. I was talking to one of the CEOs of India's largest PE funds, like the other day, and he was like, I really want to go to a gift fund or sell a gift fund. He asked me in a very simple, plain question. I have every single LP of mine is a foreign investor. He asked me the documentation. I was like, okay, documentation, I can make it into a typical contribution. I can mirror it like typical LP or shareholder agreement. Like, okay, that's good. Second question is, you think the foreign LP will finally come to you? I'm like, I give you an example that we have so many LPs who came in. His concern was that the laws are forever like on a kind of changing mode, like, in terms of right now there's a tax filing exemption for the foreign entities in gift city. Will it remain in the next 2 or 3 years? A good example is Cayman Islands. They had a similar kind of questions around this structure. And they came out with this whole 20 years saying that, okay, for the next 10 years, we will not change anything bad for you guys. You want to convert to the LPs. You can have some kind of similar model in India saying that, okay, you're coming to the gift city, for the next 10 years, we have certain guidelines. We will not deviate from there. What scares them the most is this 6 months, annual changes, and they feel that they might consider it's a 10-year fund. It's like long-term fund is a different transaction. I think we will speak to the CFO forum, and I think we'll try and, I think it's a very key component to also have that certainty in legislation, forever keep changing all the time, every second guy comes to the new regulation. This scares a lot of these foreign entities.
I think someone has been a
Yeah, that's me. Hi, my name is Utkarsh. I have specifically 2 questions for Ms. Shagoofa. One is, has the NIF been able to solve the asset liability mismatch problem in infrastructure funding? And the second is, has the IBC, the insolvency code, been of any help to the NIF?
So the second one is easier to answer because we are not into acquisition of stressed assets. We are in fact addressing the need for our investors who believe that when they were looking at India, they couldn't find credible counterparties to back because there are only these handful of developers in the country, and being from a particular culture, that integration was not being viewed as possible between the global capital and those developers with their practices. So as NIF, we in fact are building platforms. So we are creating from ground up assets with asset management teams and expertise. So we still personally, from our NIF ecosystem perspective, haven't really encountered any IBC situation. Asset liability mismatch in terms of, again, are you talking from the project level? See, so again, long-term funding, we have in fact a 15-year-old fund, right? So we have a capital which is in any case long-term. So we have selected assets which will match the ability for us to take them to the level of maturing and then creating the exit. So I don't think in a fund vehicle there would be such a disconnect. Yes, maybe if you are bringing in a particular investor into either a holding company or a set of assets where he then wants to exit in a X number of years and therefore is pushing for an IPO, pushing for an exit when the asset is not ready. Maybe those situations would be there, but for us, we ourselves being 49% government and rest of our 51% also being long-term capital, we don't see that as an issue at all from the assets that we are picking.